Good evening. As you are coming in, please scoot into the center of your rows. Every chair will be taken this evening. So believe me, you want to take every seat available, so please squeeze inside. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here. This is just an amazing audience. We're thrilled to have so many people joining us here this evening. You are in for a real treat. Tonight's speaker is a dynamic person who's a great storyteller, who's going to teach us all a lot. So I'm thrilled to have so many people here. We have a bunch of seats in the front over here. So please, if you are sitting on the floor, would like to come up, sit here, we have seats available, so please do that. So for those who I don't know, my name is Greg Schaller, and I am the director of Centennial Institute here at Colorado Christian University. We are CCU's public policy think tank and academic center, and we try to do programs like this to partner with our faculty to help in the formation of young Christians in solidifying their faith, learning about important topics. So we're thrilled to have so many great CCU students here with us this evening. As we do with all of our programs at Centennial, we begin with prayer, the pledge, and then an introduction of our speakers. So if I could have Caleb Costancio, Madison Patton, and Lucy Polvote come up, they will get our program started.
If you please join me in prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for bringing us all here this evening. We thank you for who you are, for your character, and for being the ultimate source of truth. I thank you for our speaker this evening, and I pray that you would go before him. I pray also that as a result of this evening, we would have an understanding of how C.S. Lewis and Tolkien used literature to fight the darkness and evil of their age, and that they would even encourage us today to fight the darkness and the evils of our own time. May you give us the strength we need every day to be lights to this world and to spread your truth and love in this world and to everyone we meet. May we be instruments in your hands for righteousness and truth in this world today. We love you and are grateful for all the love and compassion you have shown to us in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.
Will you please join me in standing for the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You may be seated.
Great authors capture the hearts and minds of readers. Over the past century, two stand above the rest: C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. The worlds of Narnia and Middle-earth have captivated young and old through novels and films alike. Growing up, I loved C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, and even had an opportunity to reread them again this summer. Lewis and Tolkien created worlds that enable us to grapple with significant ideological issues that still grip our society, while also growing in our own understanding of moral clarity through the beauty of truth, friendship, and courage. This evening's speaker has spent years examining the significant impact of these two great authors and how the backdrop of World War II and World War I influenced them to create these magnificent worlds. Dr. Joseph Loconte is an author, historian, and filmmaker. He currently serves as director of the Rivendell Center in New York City. He is a presidential scholar at the New College of Florida, and he is the C.S. Lewis Scholar for Public Life at Grove City College. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, A Hobbit, A Wardrobe, and a Great War, How J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis Rediscovered Faith, Friendship, and Heroism in the Cataclysm of 1914 to 1918, and his new release, The War for Middle-earth, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis Confront the Gathering Storm, 1933 to 1945. Dr. Loconte's commentary has appeared in a number of outlets, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and National Review. He also served as the commentator for NPR's All Things Considered for 10 years. Dr. Loconte is a native of Brooklyn, New York, a forlorn fan of the New York Mets, and a frequent traveler to sunny Italy. Now, while this isn't Italy, Colorado is sunny, and we are grateful for the time he has made to come out here and speak to us. With that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Loconte.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming out. Can you hear me okay back there in the bleacher seats? Everybody's good? Everybody's good? It is such a joy to be with you all. I think it's an incredible audience for an evening like this, such a beautiful evening. And I think there was a lot of great promotion done for this talk because the expectations apparently are very high. My first task is to lower the expectations. So stop the clock here, Jamie. Just a quick story. I was in Italy, sunny Italy, a few years ago, and I was in Naples, and I lost my passport. But it's Naples. It was probably stolen, but it's missing. So I'm hanging around Naples for a couple of days, waiting for the American embassy to open up to get my passport, and I realize I'm in the midst of a electoral campaign, a mayoral campaign. And there's one candidate whose face is just splattered all over Naples. And he's a farcical candidate. He looks like kind of a young Groucho Marx, for those old enough to know who Groucho Marx was. He's a farcical candidate. He's got a one-line slogan for his campaign. His slogan is, in Italian, non farò niente, ma lo farò molto bene. I will do nothing, but I will do it very well. So that's my goal tonight. That's all I got to do. Just lower the expectations. Now, guys, I'm going to talk here for a bit, but I want to engage you guys here in this talk. This is a lecture discussion, so you got a quote sheet in front of you, and I'm going to ask for volunteers along the way. I don't want you to be dime store mannequins. I'm going to pull you into this discussion as we go. How's the sound system? Working okay here? So pull out your sheets there, guys, and let's get into it. Go ahead and roll that tape, gentlemen. Great. Well, halfway through the First World War, November 30th, 1916, a group of European leaders attended the funeral of Franz Joseph, ruler over the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In a ceremony scripted by the emperor before his death, the grand cortege, carrying his coffin, halts outside the Capuchin monastery in Vienna, where all of the Habsburg emperors are laid to rest. And what transpired now is a whisper from an earlier era, a nod to the transcendence of God and the frailty of men. Okay, guys, you can freeze that just for now. So he scripted this funeral thing before his death. The herald, on behalf of the emperor, knocks on the monastery door. Who is knocking? Shouts the abbot inside. I am Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary. I don't know you, he says. Again, the herald shouts, I am Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, Bohemia, Galicia, Dalmatia, Grand Duke of Transylvania, Duke of... We still don't know who you are, interrupts the abbot. And at this moment, the herald falls on his knees and in front of all the assembled declares, I am Franz Joseph, a poor sinner, humbly begging God's mercy. Enter then, the abbot says, and the gates open. Now, the funeral of the Austro-Hungarian emperor symbolizes an outlook already in an advanced stage of decay. And we'll move with our little slide images here, guys. Here we go. Next. Don't need to plug the book, Loconte. Come on now. All right. Next. Are we live? Perfect. Settled beliefs about the religious dimension to human life are becoming unsettled here in the 1920s. Assumptions about the moral life, about the existence of good and evil, seem to have vanished in the killing fields of the 1914-1918 war. And by the end of that war, the emotional and spiritual lives of millions of ordinary Europeans were caught up in a no man's land of doubt and disillusionment. The war unleashed a storm of murderous ideologies. Fascism, Nazism, communism, totalitarianism. And the terrible result, friends, is a second world war, the most devastating war in human history. Well, two of the most influential writers of the 20th century, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, they're caught up in the fire and the fury of this conflict. We cannot begin to understand their astonishing achievements as authors until we enter into their world, friends, a world at war. And the moment we do this, we begin to see how the long shadows cast by the Second World War invaded their minds and their imaginations. We begin to see that much of what they wrote and taught was a deliberate rebuke to the spirit of the age, a rebuke to the cynicism, the lies, the hatreds, the dehumanization, and the lust for power that darken the lives of millions of ordinary people. Let me repeat that. The cynicism, the lies, the hatreds, and the dehumanization and the lust for power. Does any of that sound familiar, friends, right? I can put my thesis here in 3 words: war, friendship, and imagination. War, friendship, and imagination. It's the cataclysm of war that brings these two men together in friendship. And it's their friendship that makes possible the creation of their great imaginative works. That's the big picture. Now let's unpack it. Let's unpack it. Okay, we're in the Oxford Union, where a debate is held February 9th, 1933, and a motion is put forward for a vote. Here's the motion. This House will in no circumstances fight for its king and country. You can see it there in your handout, friends. This House will in no circumstances fight for its king and country. The motion, known as the Oxford Oath, is approved by a vote of 275 to 153. Let me pause and put the question out to you guys. What does that suggest to you about the mood of the hour in 1933 in Great Britain? These are Oxford students, the cream of the crop, declaring we will not fight for king and country. Anybody? What does this suggest to you? Say again? Pacifism, a mood of pacifism. Certainly that. Anything else? What's that? Isolationism, maybe? Somebody else's problem, maybe? Never in the long history of Great Britain had a generation of future leaders, among the best educated in the Western world, publicly renounced any obligation to defend their nation in wartime. And friends, their timing could not have been worse. It could be argued that 1933, this is the year in which the liberal democratic project of the West begins to unravel. It's the year when Woodrow Wilson's dream of a new world order based upon the brotherhood of man starts to dissolve, when naked aggression goes unchallenged, when mass murder is committed with impunity. It is the year when much of the democratic West, including the United States, turns its back on the truth. When Franklin Roosevelt arrives in office as president in 1933, the United States is in the throes of the Great Depression. He promises to solve the nation's economic woes, proclaiming that, quote, the only thing to fear is fear itself, right? Well, friends, there are other things to fear. There is militarism in Asia. Japan, under the leadership of the supposedly divine Emperor Hirohito, is waging war against China. Animated by a vision of ethnic and racial purity, the Japanese leadership has created a military state with one overriding objective: the complete territorial domination of Asia. January 1st, 1933, Japan launches an attack against the Great Wall, along the Great Wall in the Rihe province. The Japanese proceed to bomb civilian populations in virtually every major city in China. 2 months later, Japan quits the League of Nations when the League refuses to recognize its puppet regime in Manchuria. In the Soviet Union, there is mass starvation and political violence. Under the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, the communist regime is engaged in what appears to be a campaign of extermination against its peasant population. Stalin's policy of collectivization has created, friends, a famine of biblical proportions. By the spring of 1933, between 5 and 7 million people are dead. Millions more on the brink of starvation. In Ukraine, once the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, the famine is killing about 25,000 people a day. And opponents of Stalin's policies are sent to concentration camps. In Italy, Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator swept into power in 1922, determined to restore Italian greatness on the world stage. By 1933, Mussolini is secretly drawing up plans to invade Ethiopia, making it a colonial possession. And then there's Nazi Germany. January 30th, 1933, barely 10 days, friends, 10 days before that Oxford Union Society vote, Adolf Hitler is elevated to chancellor, making him the second most powerful person in the country. 2 days later, he dissolves parliament. So the German government is now led by a man who had announced his intention to tear up the Versailles Treaty, rebuild the military, pursue a policy of territorial expansion. That's the backdrop. That's the political backdrop at this moment in 1933, the start of an unprecedented assault on the moral norms of Western civilization. It's at this moment, friends, that J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis engage their literary talents to try to hold the line. Try to hold the line. Now, we don't know exactly when Tolkien started writing The Hobbit, but he completes the first draft early 1933. The story's protagonist, Bilbo Baggins, lives in Bag End, the underground home in the village of Hobbiton, and, he likes to mind his own business, right? But one day, he's visited by that wizard, Gandalf, 13 dwarves, just show up unannounced, right? They're driven out of their homes by a dragon named Smaug. Now, reluctantly, Bilbo is thrust into this dangerous adventure, and along the way, he acquires a ring that allows him to become invisible. A distinguishing trait of Bilbo Baggins is courage. Courage, but not the sort of courage one finds in classical or medieval epics. He's filled with what, friends? Self-doubt, right? His battles are usually internal. Should he risk exposing himself to danger to help the company? He's kind of a modern hero, and he does face deadly enemies. Let me get a volunteer to read this paragraph. Now, goblins are cruel. Can I get a volunteer? Nice and loud and clear will be the challenge for the volunteer. Now, goblins are cruel. Right here, young man, up front. Nice and loud and clear. You want to stand? I knew you did. Also known as microphones, instruments of torture.
Check. There we go. And also instruments of torture they make very well. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once, for wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. All right, friends, bear down on those sentences for a few moments. What's it sound like? What does it sound like he's describing? War. Anything more specific? World War I. It sounds like an author who's lived through the industrial slaughter of the First World War. The Hobbit has been described as a book about entering manhood, right? Maybe in the end it's about much more than that. The hero in this story does not carry the fate of a civilization on his shoulders. That's true, as he does in The Lord of the Rings. But he leaves the safety of his hobbit hole, doesn't he? And he confronts genuine evil. He must even put his own life at risk to help his friends, resisting the powerful temptation to just slip away to safety and return home. Here's the point. The First World War produced a flood of writers disenchanted with the concepts of courage and sacrifice. Many are consumed with the idea of lost innocence, right? The Hobbit is the beginning of Tolkien's reply, they shall not have the last word. Well, C.S. Lewis is engaged in a similar literary counterattack, 1933. He publishes The Pilgrim's Regress, a spiritual autobiography in which he exposes the ideologies that were all the rage during his years as an atheist, the 1920s into the 30s. He tackles Freudianism, materialism, fascism, communism. Lewis argues that the radical ideologies of the left and the right are fundamentally totalitarian. They both function, as he put it, as forces of mass violence waiting to be unleashed. 1933. Well, Lewis takes on what's known as the modernist movement in literature and the arts. The modernist movement embedded itself in the leading cultural institutions in the 1920s and 30s. Modernism rejects traditional views of the human person as rational, as responsible, as a moral being. The emphasis with modernism is on the absurd, the nonsensical, the irrational. Think T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, right? The Wasteland. In a chapter in Lewis's book here, The Pilgrim's Regress, in a chapter entitled Freedom of Thought, Lewis skewers the intellectual and artistic set of those post-war years, 1920s, 1930s. He calls them the clevers, because they're so clever. There's cynicism, right? The conversation in his book runs this way, of the clevers. You've got to realize satire is the moving force in modern music. It's the expression of a savage disillusionment. Our art must be brutal. Reality has broken down, explains a very clever, young clever. We lost our ideals when there was a war in this country. They were ground out of us in the mud and the flood and the blood. Is probably not a better, more concise description of the intellectual mood of that literary movement. Our ideals were ground out of us in the mud and the flood and the blood. This is worth thinking about, friends. Maybe we'll get to this in the Q&A, but think about this. What makes many young people today disillusioned? Disillusioned. I don't know that we have too many disillusioned people in this room, but you probably all know young people who are disillusioned. Let's think about that for the Q&A. Well, let's pick up the story, 1936. 1936, another watershed year. Mussolini seizes the capital of Ethiopia in an unprovoked war of aggression. The League of Nations, which is supposed to prevent or punish violations of international law, does nothing. of the Silent Planet, the first book in the space trilogy. It is a deeply Christian story, isn't it, friends? Involving this trio of earthlings who travel to another planet, Malacandra, Mars, where they encounter think about this now, 3 different species of rational creatures living in perfect harmony and social peace. Think about that. 3 different species living together peacefully. At the moment he's writing, 1937, 38, racial hatreds are simmering and threatening to destroy civilization on Earth. The story's protagonist, Elwin Ransom, a Cambridge professor, a language guy, a philologist, clearly modeled on Tolkien. Ransom represents the rehabilitation of modern man, a man of faith, obedient to the good. So, Ransom has to battle 2 other travelers, Dick Devine, a profiteer, Dr. Weston, a mad physicist hell-bent on planting the human species on other planets, right? And they meet the planet's ruling intelligence, the Oyarsa, who reveals to Ransom that terrifying secret. His beloved home of Thulkandra, Earth, has become a cautionary tale, right, throughout the universe. A silent planet, friends. A silent planet alienated from the joy of heaven because of its rebellion against the good. Lewis describes this climactic exchange between Ransom and the Oyarsa. The Oyarsa wants to understand why he and his companions have come to his planet in the first place. Lewis's character gives him an answer. Ransom gives him an answer. And let me read it to you, folks, and let's get some reaction on this. Out of the Silent Planet, I think he, Dr. Weston, would destroy all your people to make room for our people. And then he would do the same with other worlds again. He wants our race to last for always, I think, and hopes they will leap from world to world. What do you make of that? Think about what he's writing, publishing in 1938 and the world situation. Over to you. What do you think? What does it make you think? What's that? Germany, why? That's a huge part of the answer. The military advance. But what else is, of course, Hitler doing? Not just planning to do, but beginning to do. The Holocaust. The final solution, right? C.S. Lewis does not need to invent this apocalyptic possibility through fiction. Weston would destroy one race to make room for his own. Friends, it's occurring on Britain's doorstep. In Hitler's Mein Kampf, the elimination of the Jewish people from Europe is essential for Germany's attainment of living space for the Aryan race. By the time Lewis began writing the Ransom series, this goal is already the focus of Hitler's domestic policy. Before Lewis completes the Ransom trilogy in 1945, the genocide of the Jews has become the most important cause of Germany's wars of aggression. Experiments by Nazi scientists to support the Third Reich, from eugenics to radar to rockets, are well known, friends, well known. The last book of the series, That Hideous Strength, what does it teach us? It teaches us a lot of things. But one thing is, without the restraint of a moral code, without the restraint of Christian morality, government power will align itself with the scientific community to create a totalitarian state. Let me say it again. Without the anchor of a moral code, the natural drift is for government power to combine itself with the scientific elite, scientific community, to bring about an autocratic totalitarian state. Does any of that sound familiar? All right? Well, Lewis imbues his stories, of course, with this deeply religious quality. They retell the biblical account of the fall, and the cosmic struggle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And it comes as something of a shock to Lewis now. Most of the reviewers of his first book, Out of the Silent Planet, the people who review it, serious, thoughtful, intellectual people, Times of London, other reviewers, they fail to notice the religious doctrines at the center of the story, and Lewis writes about it to his friend, Sister Penelope. Can I get somebody to read C.S. Lewis to Sister Penelope? Microphone on the move. Right here? Yeah? Yeah. You will be both grieved.
You will be both grieved and amused to learn that 1 out of about 60 reviews, only 2 showed any knowledge that my idea of the bent one was anything but a private invention of my own. But if only there were someone with a richer talent and more leisure, I believe this great ignorance might be a help to the evangelization of England. Any amount of theology can now be smuggled into people's mind under cover of romance without their knowing it.
Do you get what's happening, friends? Do you get what's happening? For the first time, he's beginning to realize, holy crow, the potential to use the genre of myth and epic and fantasy to recover the teachings of the Bible for an unbelieving generation, to smuggle them in through fiction, because the country then has become so secular. They can't even recognize these big biblical doctrines, but they can be smuggled in. And I love that line. If only there was someone with a richer talent and more leisure time. It's a turning point in his life. He begins to realize he can do this. He can do this. In 1938, 39. Well, by 1938, barely 20 years after surviving what was the most devastating conflict in history, the First World War, great celebrations at the time, Tolkien and Lewis now, by 1938, they are watching in anguish as new forces of aggression gather and dominate the landscape of Europe. One of the things I love to do as an historian is getting to people's letters, their personal letters, right, that are published, not hidden away somewhere that I can't get to, but published, the letters, because they never expected to see them published. And now we're getting an insight into what they're really thinking at the moment. Here's what C.S. Lewis writes to his friend Dom Griffiths, April 1938. I have been in considerable trouble over the present danger of war, he says, twice in one life, and then to find how little I have grown in fortitude despite my conversion. October 5th, writes again to Griffiths. I was terrified to find how terrified I was by the crisis. Pray for me for courage. Writing to his publisher, October 13th, 1938, J.R.R. Tolkien also has the prospect of war in mind. He says his new story about Middle-earth now is, quote, becoming more terrifying than The Hobbit. He worries it may prove quite unsuitable for young people because it carries more of an adult tone. And then he says this, the darkness of the present days has had some effect on it. Well, the crisis and the darkness of which Lewis and Tolkien speak, the fear of another European war arrives like a thunderbolt, friends, like a thunderbolt in the spring of 1938. History majors out there, what's the crisis in 1938? Sudetenland, what about it? Sudetenland. You got it by the throat, young man. You got it by the throat. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, had left 3.5 million Germans within the borders of the newly created Czechoslovakia. In 1938, Hitler begins complaining about the treatment of these ethnic Germans in Sudetenland, this portion of Czechoslovakia bordering Germany, and he demands that they be incorporated back into the Third Reich. He invites the British Prime Minister at the time, Neville Chamberlain, come on down to Munich, September 29th, to negotiate an end to the crisis. The negotiations conclude in the early morning hours of September 30th, sealing the fate of Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland will be turned over to Germany. Well, without firing a shot, without a vote, without even the presence of the Czechs at the negotiating table, they weren't invited. The borders of Czechoslovakia are redrawn, and Chamberlain is hailed as a great peacemaker. Thousands of telegrams flow into 10 Downing Street to congratulate him on his great achievement of peace. But you know, friends, not everybody is celebrating. In a speech before the House of Commons, a few days later, Winston Churchill denounces the Munich Pact as a disaster of the first magnitude, and he makes this prediction. Don't suppose this is the end, he says. This is only the beginning of the reckoning. This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup, which will be proffered to us year by year, unless by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor, we arise again and take our stand for freedom, as in the olden time. After Churchill becomes prime minister in 1940, he will play an indispensable political role in mobilizing the British people for war, sustaining their war spirit over the next 5 years. But think about it. The reconstitution of moral health and martial vigor, that's a cultural task, friends, isn't it? You can't write an executive order for that. That's a cultural task. And guess what? J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, I think they take on this obligation deliberately, consciously, not as wartime propagandists, but as authors, academics who believe that their scholarship, their teaching, and their imaginative literature, it can help shake a generation loose from its moral cynicism and its spiritual lethargy. And in this great task, they draw from deep wells, friends, the collective wisdom of the literary canon of Western civilization. Homer, Virgil, Dante, Milton, that's their intellectual furniture, friends. And yet all of that is at risk. The entire future of their civilization is cast into doubt September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland, the beginning of World War II. 2 weeks after Britain's declaration of war, Tolkien writes to his publisher to explain why he doesn't expect to make much progress now on his new book about the hobbits. Why? Anybody recognize that? Here's what he says. Any far-reaching work of my own is out of the question. I'm liable to be summoned to a job undertaken last spring at any moment. I've got no idea what time, if any, outside of it I'll have. The job he's talking about is codebreaker. Codebreaker for the British Foreign Office at Bletchley Park. He gets training, several days of training as a codebreaker. In the end, they're not going to need his services, but they know this guy knows languages. They'd love to get him on their side. At the end, they don't use him. But Oxford now faces the possibility of what? Massive bombing raids, food shortages, the likelihood of a land invasion, friends. So what happens? The government begins evacuating mothers and children from London. This is 1939 now. Other cities, to the English countryside to escape the anticipated bombing campaign. Nearly 3 million people evacuated during the first 4 days of the Exodus. 12-year-old Lillian Hanson, an evacuee from London, captures the moment as eloquently as any journalist on the scene. Here's a few lines from what she wrote. A sadder day there was never before, when all mothers rich and poor stood and wept when their children went away on the great evacuation day. Well, 4 children, all girls, appear at C.S. Lewis's home at Oxford at the Kilns the day after the Nazi invasion of Poland. I'm a bachelor, Lewis tells his friend, Sister Penelope. I never appreciated children till the war brought them to me. Patricia Heidelberger is one of those girls, reflecting on that time, first meeting C.S. Lewis, one of the evacuees. Here's what she wrote. My first impression of C.S. Lewis was that of a shabbily clad, rather portly gentleman whom I took to be the gardener and told him so. He roared, he boomed with laughter. So Lewis will stir an intellectual awakening in the young people who come into his home. But friends, their presence transforms him as well. From a confirmed bachelor who doesn't enjoy the company of children, to the author of one of the most beloved series of children's books in modern fiction, The Chronicles of Narnia. And war, friends, war is the spark that lights the flame of his imagination. It is probably at this time, in 1939 now, after children evacuees have become a fixture in the Lewis home, they keep coming, Lewis scribbles the opening lines of the first book in the series. And can I get a volunteer, C.S. Lewis, 1939, on your back page to read those opening lines for us? The microphone is on the move. Right here. Yeah. Read those opening lines.
The book is about 4 children whose names were Anne, Martin, Rose, and Peter. They had to go away from London, suddenly because of the air raids, and because father, who was in the army, had gone off to war, and mother was doing some kind of war work. They were sent to stay with a very old professor who lived by himself in the country.
Thank you, sir. They were sent to stay with a very old professor who lived by himself in the country. Lewis is going to rename 3 of the 4 children, right, in the final version. But the catalyst for the adventure into Narnia is the same. The great evacuation from London at the start of the Second World War. So the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The Pevensie children, think about it. The Pevensie children flee the terrors of a world at war, only to enter Narnia, where another war is being waged between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. Well, the Council of Elrond in The Lord of the Rings, this is a war council, by the way, friends, a war council. Gandalf the wizard describes his encounter with Saruman, who pressed upon him a scheme to make peace with the forces of Mordor. Here's how Tolkien describes it. This is Saruman. A new power is rising. Against it, the old allies and policies will not avail us at all. The only sensible course, he says, is to be on the right side of the overwhelming power with the ultimate hope of directing it, right? Well, May 1940, with Britain now at war with Germany, with virtually all of Western Europe under Nazi control, Britain's Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, takes a page out of Saruman's book of diplomacy. Halifax approaches Prime Minister Winston Churchill about an offer from Italy's Mussolini to help Britain negotiate a settlement. Negotiate a settlement with Hitler's Germany. Neville Chamberlain, who had resigned as prime minister, brought into Churchill's cabinet. He's ready to consider decent terms if they're offered. The French premier tries to convince Churchill to engage with the Nazis or allow France to make a separate peace with Germany, right? The international situation, friends, is desperate in May of 1940. Think about what's happened. May 13th, German tanks had shattered the French line racing westward. British and French forces driven north toward the coast at Dunkirk. Churchill orders the British Royal Navy to take all possible measures to evacuate its troops from the continent. May 27th, 1940, 200,000 British soldiers encircled at Dunkirk, together with about 160,000 French and Belgian troops. Hitler's Wehrmacht is poised to annihilate them. So it's at this moment, this exact moment, while waiting for news from the beaches at Dunkirk, that Winston Churchill listens to Halifax's plan for this negotiated peace. 2 days later, this is what he tells his cabinet. I'm convinced that every man of you would rise up and tear me down from my place if I were for one moment to contemplate parley or surrender. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. That, friends, is leadership. That's leadership. Winston Churchill's determination to resist Nazism at all costs, echoed in every major speech he delivers throughout the war. It has a transformative effect on the British people, right? But I think it can also be discerned in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. Remember the battle of the Pelennor fields. Could I get somebody to read for us The Lord of the Rings? Stern now was Eomer's mood. Microphone on the move, right over here.
Stern now was Eomer's mood, and his mind clear again. He let blow the horns to rally all men to his banner that could come hither, for he thought to make a great shield wall at the last, and stand, and fight there on foot till all fell, and do deeds of song on the fields of Pelennor.
Thank you, sir. Make a great shield wall at the last and stand. Well, when Frodo and Sam journey into Mordor in their attempt to destroy the Ring of Power, they're exhausted, right? Nearly overcome by the black skies, the painful fumes. Frodo casts himself upon the ground. Sam resolves his internal debate about what he must do. Remember those lines from Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings? He knew all the arguments of despair and would not listen to them. His will was set, and only death would break it. Friends, think about it. This is the spirit of the British people in the summer of 1940 as they prepare for the Battle of Britain. Now, England could not have won the war against Nazi Germany on its own. I understand that. But think about it. Britain could have lost the war. They could have lost the war. And what would have happened if they'd lost the war? If they'd made a negotiated peace? There's no Normandy invasion. There's no D-Day. There's no place to launch the troops from, right? So by holding on, what do the British people do by holding on and resisting? They buy for America and her allies the most precious commodity possible. They buy us time. Time. Time to rid ourselves of our selfish isolationism and to find the courage and the resolve to confront the darkness. And by July 1940, the darkness is all around them. Everything Hitler has promised the German people has come true. In less than a decade, he's torn up the Treaty of Versailles, he's revived the economy, he's rebuilt the military, he's regained German lands seized after the First World War, he's reunited ethnic Germans under the Third Reich, he's neutralized the nation's enemies, and he's restored Germany's prestige on the world stage. So after the defeat of France, the German people, they are ready to follow him anywhere. Hitler's speech to the Reichstag, the German parliament, July 19th, 1940, broadcast around the world, evokes the hatreds and the triumphalism of the Nazi movement. And guess who's listening to that broadcast? C.S. Lewis is listening to that broadcast with his doctor friend, Dr. Robert Hayward. It's aired on the BBC, simultaneously translated into English. They listen to it together, and it has an almost hypnotic effect. Listen to Lewis's letter he writes to his brother about the effect of the speech. I don't know if I'm weaker than other people, but it is a positive revelation to me that while the speech lasts, it is impossible not to waver just a little. While the speech lasts, he says, it's impossible not to waver just a little. Over to you, friends. What does that tell you? What does this suggest to you about what's going on at this moment? What does it make you think? C.S. Lewis, not a particularly gullible person. While the speech lasts, Hitler's speech, it's impossible not to waver just a little. What do you think? What does that suggest? Does it suggest anything? Anybody? Right here. Couldn't have said it better. A madman, but a compelling madman. The ability to persuade, to inspire through all kinds of devices. And even C.S. Lewis finds himself wavering a little while the speech lasts. Wow. Wow. Well, why do I say all this? The next, 2 days later, this is on Friday. 2 days later, he's in church, Holy Trinity Church and C.S. Lewis listening to a sermon. I don't know how bad the sermon was, but he gets the idea for a diabolical fantasy. It'll consist of the secret correspondence between a senior devil and a young novice trying to frustrate the plans of the enemy, God, and secure the soul of their patient for their father in hell, Satan. He calls his book, of course, the Screwtape Letters. It'll help establish him as one of the most important Christian authors of his day. Friends, it can't be a coincidence. Friday, he hears the speech from Hitler. Sunday in church, he starts thinking about the devil. In a work of satire, we find the roots of the totalitarian temptation. The political religions, and that's probably a good phrase to use here, these ideologies, political ideologies that have become substitute religions, right? Political religions, they claim to be the solution to our deepest problems, social problems. All of this, Lewis implies in the Screwtape Letters, has emerged from the pit of hell. It's all happening during the Second World War, friends. Okay, 1941. It's a destitute year for Great Britain, 1941. And let's understand why and the impact it's having on Lewis and Tolkien. Even after the collapse of democracy in Europe, the Nazi domination over half the continent, the fall of France, the devastating bombing raids on London, after all of this, the most powerful democracy in the world, the United States, remains on the sidelines of the conflict. Think about that. Go back just for a few months in the fall of 1940, at the height of the Blitz. Franklin Roosevelt is on the campaign trail, presidential election campaign, repeatedly promising the the American people, that he'll keep the United States out of another European war. Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. The United States of America shall and remain unentangled and free. Roosevelt keeps up the rhetoric throughout the last days of the 1940 presidential campaign. Just one line here, Boston, October 30th, 1940. I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. Our ambassador, the American ambassador to Great Britain, Joseph Kennedy, concludes in November 1940, democracy is finished in England. That's where the United States is. But that's where Britain is. Britain is alone, friends. Britain is alone. So 1941 looks like it might be the year of collapse. Tolkien suggests as much in a letter in January 1941 to his son Michael, his oldest son, who's serving as an anti-aircraft gunner in the British military. You parents out there, think about this. You fought in the First World War, and now your oldest son is fighting in the Second World War. Think about the stress and the anxiety of that. This is what Tolkien writes to his son. Plain reasoning seems to show that Hitler must attack this country direct and very heavily soon and before the summer. Writing to Michael again in March 1941. Tolkien admits that his son's fear that he might not survive the war is not unfounded. Here's what he says. None of us may survive, he writes to his son, not even Priscilla, the youngest, the daughter. I often have a sudden, horrible fear that we shall all perish. Tolkien recalls the dread in his letter to his son. He remembers the dread that engulfed him as a soldier when he went out to the Western Front in 1916. Somebody read that for us. J.R.R. Tolkien to Michael Tolkien, 1941. I never expected to survive. Got a volunteer out there? Give my voice a break for a second. Volunteer? Right over here. Microphone on the move.
I never expected to survive. In the tense emotion of regret, the vivid, almost raw perception of the young man who feels himself doomed to die before he has said his word it was with me still. A cloud, a patch of sun, a star were often more than I could bear.
Thank you so much. Now, folks, just focus on these lines just for a moment. Bear down on these lines and walk into his world. What do you think he's communicating to his son? How do you describe it? the feeling of himself being doomed. It's still with me, he says. It's 1941. It's 20 plus years since the First World War. He says the emotion is still with him. A cloud, a patch of sun, a star were often more than I can bear. What do you think he meant by that? That these stabs of beauty, the things we take for granted, he's not going to be able to experience them again because it's all going to come to an end. And it's almost overwhelming to him. He's connecting with his son. He knows his son is thinking the same thing, right? I never expected to survive, he says. Okay. Near Tolkien's home in North Oxford is an RAF, Royal Air Force airfield, a training center for British pilots. Sunday afternoon, May 4th, 1941, a Whitley V bomber is flying over New Marston with 3 crew members on board. Priscilla, the youngest, the daughter, playing outside with her friends in the garden. Christopher, youngest son, tracking the plane with his telescope when they see black smoke pouring from the engines. One of its engines is misfiring, and the plane, with a full load of fuel, is struggling to maintain altitude. Tolkien's children can see it's going to crash. The plane hits the western bank of the River Cherwell, slides up Linton Road, hitting a farm cottage and exploding in a ball of black smoke, followed by the crackle of exploding ammunition. J.R.R. Tolkien jumps on his bicycle, rushes to the scene, joined by policemen, a member of the Home Guard. Tolkien later says, he tells his children, that there were, quote, great acts of heroism by local people who braved the fire before official help arrived. All 3 crew members perish, as well as one of the local residents. And a man, here's the thing, a man unnamed climbed into the burning house to rescue a boy trapped in an upstairs room, saved his life. To this day, we don't know who that man was who charged into that burning building. Was it Tolkien? I want to think it was. I don't know. He would have been too modest to say. But that's life, friends. The point is, that's life in England in 1939, 1940, 1941. The destitute year of 1941. December 7th, 1941, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, surprise attack on the United States, crippling the Navy, killing 3,200 soldiers, civilians. On the same day, Japan attacks the British outpost of Malaya, sinking the British battleship, the Prince of Wales, kills 840 sailors outright, gone. Hong Kong falls on Christmas Day with reports of the rape and massacre of many civilians. Japan is now at war with America and Great Britain. Germany declares war on the United States and forms a military alliance with Japan and Italy. It is now a global conflict. The one thing everyone wanted to avoid has now happened. Think about that Oxford Union oath in 1933. Well, it's a global conflict. And guess what? December 1941. Tolkien's daughter Priscilla gets a letter from Father Christmas. Father Christmas. Tolkien began writing and illustrating his Father Christmas letters to his children when they were just toddlers. The letters are usually filled with the escapades of the polar bear, the chief assistant to Father Christmas, whose comical adventures affect the annual Christmas stock. In 1933, the letters took on a more menacing tone, however, with the introduction of the goblins. The Christmas letter of 1941, the goblins are front and center. Take a look down your quote page here, friends. I never expected to, excuse me. I don't think I gave you that. Nope. Scratch that. I'll read it to you. Goblins, front and center, 1941. I expect you remember that some years ago we had trouble with the goblins. We thought we had settled it. Well, it broke out again, and worse than it's been for centuries. Father Christmas notes that fewer children have written to him than in previous years. Here's his explanation to Priscilla. I expect it's because of this horrible war. So terribly many people have lost their homes or have left them. Half the world seems in the wrong place. That's Father Christmas letter to Priscilla. Merry Christmas, Priscilla. Right? He can't escape. You can't escape the reality of the war. And he's not going to shield his children from it either, right? Well, the war is stirring up new interest in the consolations of religion, but creating doubt and despair as well. The director of the BBC's religious broadcasting department asked C.S. Lewis now, give me a series of talks explaining and defending the Christian faith. The BBC in 1940-41, how far they have fallen. Unbelievable. Well, C.S. Lewis rarely listens to the radio. He's not inclined to do it, but he agrees. He travels from Oxford to London to record his talks. His trips are not without risk, friends, because Nazi bombing raids, they continue throughout the war. The BBC's broadcasting house has been hit several times, people killed. In the opening line of his first broadcast for the BBC, August 1941, this is how Lewis begins his radio broadcast. The opening line in 1941. Everyone has heard people quarreling. Everyone has heard people quarreling. What do we do when we quarrel? We appeal to some standard that the other guy, the other lady, has broken. You stole from my term paper. That's not right. You stole a piece of my fruit. Give it back, right? We appeal to a moral standard. We quarrel. That's how he starts. For the next 15 minutes, from 7:45 to 8 p.m., this self-described amateur, former atheist, introduces the BBC audience to the concept of what, friends? A universal moral law. A universal moral law. Think about it. At a moment in world history when the moral foundations of Western civilization seem to be disintegrating, here is someone trying to reverse the rot. Now, one of the most provocative talks is called The Invasion. The Invasion. Lewis uses the war setting as a metaphor for the spiritual conflict that's raging in everyday life. The Christian faith, he says, teaches that the struggle between light and darkness, this is not a war between independent powers. Take a look at your quote page. This struggle. It is a civil war, a rebellion, and we are living in a part of the universe occupied by the rebel. Enemy occupied territory. That is what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed. You might say, landed in disguise, and is calling us all to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. Do we think of our faith, for those of us who are members of the Christian faith, do we think of our faith in those terms, that we live in enemy-occupied territory? And everyone who heard that broadcast, that first broadcast, 7:45 to 8 o'clock, that particular broadcast, the invasion, they would have known exactly what he was talking about, right? Occupied France, the French resistance, the resistance movements in different places in Europe trying to defeat the Nazis. They knew exactly what he's talking about, right? So the broadcast, edited into a book, Mere Christianity, one of the most influential works of Christian apologetics ever written. Probably the most cited, commonly cited works of a Christian apologetics in a couple of hundred years. Has to be. Conceived in the fire and the fury of the Second World War. Well, as we begin to wrap up here, friends, by December 1941, Tolkien has taken his story to the breaking of the fellowship. Boromir, one of the company, tries to take the ring from Frodo by force, right? The ring that gives you the power to make yourself invisible. And whoever possesses the one ring controls all the others. One ring to rule them all. One ring to find them. One ring to bring them all and in the darkness bind them, my precious. The ring of power, friends, it's the motive force behind Sauron's attempt to enslave or destroy any living thing that stands in his way. This is how Tolkien describes him. He brooked no freedom, nor any rivalry, and he named himself Lord of the Earth. Let me say that one again. He brooked no freedom, nor any rivalry, and he named himself Lord of the Earth. What does that sound like? Anybody? Might sound obvious, maybe not so obvious. Sounds like Hitler, yeah? It sounds like a literary expression of a political ideology, totalitarianism. Totalitarianism. This is the geopolitical reality, friends, as Tolkien is composing his story. As he's writing it, this is the reality. This is the outlook dominating the regimes in Tokyo, Berlin, Rome, Moscow. Art is imitating life. Life is imitating art. When Tolkien was in the trenches in the First World War, he wrote a story in the trenches that would become part of his legendarium of Middle-earth, The Fall of Gondolin. The Fall of Gondolin. Well, now, during the nightmare years of 1939 to 1945, it seems that Tolkien, he's writing his epic tale under the shadow of these regimes that threatened the survival of Western civilization. And now it looks like the disaster of the Second World War compels Tolkien to bring to full maturity the story he had begun during the 1914-1918 war. And I think part of his achievement is that he persuades his readers that his mythology, his fiction, it's like reality. It's like reality because it reveals the human condition, man's dignity, as well as man's shame. But there's another aspect to this achievement, I think, friends. Another aspect. Unlike any other quest story in literature that we kind of know of, in The Lord of the Rings, the hero's supreme objective, it's not to endure dangers in order to acquire or recover something of value, right? The terrible suspense of the story is whether two solitary hobbits prepared to risk all can complete their task of destroying something of great value, the Ring of Power. So Tolkien's heroes, they don't seek glory for themselves or their kinsmen. Their mission, think about it, their mission is of one complete renunciation of the self for a noble cause. Complete renunciation of the self for a noble cause, the redemption of Middle-earth from the designs of the Dark Lord. So what values, what ideals is he holding up? Self-denial, humility, the rejection of worldly power, the need for redemption. Think about it. In the immediate political context of the Second World War, with nations on all sides desperate to acquire weapons of mass destruction, this message of renunciation could not have been more counter-cultural. Remember what Frodo tells Sam just before he leaves the Shire? I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. It must often be so, Sam, when things are in danger. Someone has to give them up, to lose them, so that others may keep them. I think this helps to explain why Tolkien and Lewis became such kindred spirits. These are the threads that brought these two men together in friendship. They're veterans of the First World War who endured great loss early in their lives. They are writers with an imaginative life of incredible reach and richness. They are scholars, nourished by the literary canon of Western civilization. And they are guardians, friends. They are guardians of a deep and generous Christian faith. They both seek to use their scholarship and their imagination for the restoration of humanity at a moment of existential crisis for the West. Many of the young people who studied under Tolkien, people like you, young people like you, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, who studied under them, they later recalled the sense of living through this singular moment in their lives, because we have some of their letters and their essays. Listen to Rachel Trickett. Rachel Trickett, a student of C.S. Lewis. We made our way weekly through the blackouts to hear this extraordinary man. Pupils who survived the combat of his tutorials learned to love and rely on his humanity and loyalty and his stealthy generosity. Helen Terrell Wheeler attended lectures by Tolkien, was a pupil of Lewis during the war. War news, which is wrenching, unavoidable. Here's what she says, though. At few times can there have been such splendidly exciting lectures and such overflowing lecture halls, she says. What it meant for my generation of English language and literature undergraduates was that what happened in the great books was of equal significance to what happened in life. Indeed, that they were the same. Do we even grasp what she's saying? What happened in the great books was of equal significance to what happened in life. That's how it feels. So what did these two men do? They helped the generation to understand that the truths and the ideals expressed in the great works of the classical and medieval worlds were deeply relevant to the events of the modern world, this world at war. Because, friends, for a time, it really did seem that the forces of barbarism are going to prevail, that the eclipse of Western civilization is at hand. It really looks as if the survival of England depends upon the choices of quite small people, as Tolkien put it, who overcome their fears and fight the terror from the skies. If we are looking for a model of Christian cultural leadership in a time of profound cultural crisis, we have one, friends. We have one. So how should we think about this? None of this would have happened, I think, if these two men had not become friends. Walter Hooper, who served as C.S. Lewis's personal secretary near the end of his life, he passed away a few years ago. I had a chance to interview him personally. He's in his 80s. So he lives with C.S. Lewis, gets to know him pretty well. Tolkien said to Walter Hooper that he was more interested, Tolkien was more interested in working with languages, building up languages, than writing a sequel to The Hobbit. But Lewis helped to change his mind. This is what Tolkien said to Walter Hooper, who then told me. You know, C.S. Lewis was such a boy. He had to have a story. And that story, The Lord of the Rings, was written to keep him quiet. Well, at the very least, as Tolkien admitted, without Lewis's great encouragement and demands for more, give me more dollars, give me more, he never would have completed The Lord of the Rings. And when he finally does, not long after the Second World War, Tolkien sends the draft, the manuscript, to his friend. And take a look down at the end of your quote page there, friends. He writes to Tolkien, Lewis writes to Tolkien, he has the manuscript now. He says, I've drained the rich cup, I've satisfied a long thirst. And then he says this, so much of your whole life, Tolkien, so much of your whole life, so much of our joint life, so much of the war, so much that seemed to be slipping away without a trace into the past is now, in a sort, made permanent. Do we even grasp what he's saying? Somehow, Tolkien has captured something of their common life together. He's captured something of the quality of it during wartime. And friends, it's hidden in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. I think that's what he's saying. This is what friendship can achieve, ladies and gentlemen, when it reaches for a high purpose and it's watered by the streams of sacrifice and loyalty and love. It is written in my life's blood, Tolkien said, such as that is, thick or thin. Pretty thick blood. Pretty thick blood. There is a sublime quality to the works of these authors, isn't there, friends, that stretches across time and across cultures. That J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis could create stories of such radiance and beauty and nobility when the world around them was so dark and disfigured. This, to me, seems like a mystery of grace. They knew, friends, they knew what it was like to live in the land of shadow. And yet, like Sam Gamgee on the threshold of Mordor, they pressed on. They pressed on through the darkness, and they left for us a bright glimpse of the far-off country. Here is how Tolkien describes it. And there, peeping among the cloud rack, high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out on the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing, because there was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. Light and beauty beyond the walls of this world. May each of us find the courage and the grace and the faith to see it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much. All right, we are going to try and get through a few questions very quickly. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, identify yourself, wait for the mic, make sure your question is a question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. My name is Russell. I'm a recent graduate of CCU, studied philosophy. My question for you is, given that our time is, as many have described, much more like Brave New World than 1984, what do you see Tolkien and Lewis saying to us with the challenges we face today?
That's a fabulous question. Can I get like a yes-no kind of question, one of those? That's a fabulous question, young man, terrific. What would they say? I can only speculate. I can just take a stab at it as they would evaluate this. Because in some ways, if you think about it, the response that many people are having of disillusionment and cynicism about things, indifference, well, that mood is kind of in the air in a lot of places, not just among young people, but especially among young people. And they knew what that was like. So they're going to want to push back against that. And I think what they achieve in their works is they reach back into this older tradition, the heroic tradition, where the ideas of humility, sacrifice, courage, friendship, they want to reintroduce these ideas and reinvent them for the modern mind. And I think they would want to somehow help us to do the same. Because we can't live without these qualities. We can't live without courage and fortitude and sacrifice and bravery and friendship. Those are universals. They're absolutely essential. I think they want to bring those, they want to emphasize those same ideals again in our current moment of crisis. I think they would. Great question. Stab of an answer.
Hi. What do you think is the role of literature today in helping to advance those ideals that Lewis and Tolkien tried to fight for?
Fabulous question. I mean, it's immensely important that we not only engage the logical arguments, right? Lewis could do that brilliantly. That's one part of his brain, but he gets this other part of his brain, doesn't he? The imaginative, the creative, the myth, fiction. And he believed it was deeply important to use storytelling to reintroduce these great truths. Part of the challenge we have today is, as I've suggested in this talk, is these guys are rooted in an intellectual and literary tradition. It's called the Western canon. You can be grateful here at Colorado Christian University, you're hanging on to that. How about 3 cheers for that? Because not many schools are the Western canon. I don't think you get The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Chronicles of Narnia, The Abolition of Man, The Space Trilogy, unless you are grounded in that Western canon. Homer, Virgil, Dante, Milton, Beowulf, etc. So that's part of the challenge is I think we've got to reintroduce those classic works, but also very much rooted in a Christian foundation, which is what those men did, I think, uniquely. They're borrowing from the ancient world, classical Rome, classical Greece, medieval world, but boy, they're giving it this deeply Christian outlook. We need more writers who can do that and do it brilliantly. So let the games begin. Who else?
Hi, I'm Brandon. I'm a pre-nursing student here. Thank you for coming. So my question to you, and I think you answered it, but I think if I could just get a very explicit answer from you, which is that there's a lot of debate between Christians and other like secular lovers of Lord of the Rings, and Christians obviously like to claim that it's a Christian allegory. Myself included in that group of people, and then secular lovers of Lord of the Rings who say, no, it's not actually an allegory, like your parallels are just, you're reading into it too much.
Yeah.
And so if I could get like an explicit yes or no, that would make my night.
Finally, a yes or no question. No, I can't give you a yes or no question. I'm going to give you a partial answer to that question. It's a great question. And a couple of pieces to it. When the book came out, when the Lord of the Rings came out in the 1950s, the atomic age, the bomb is out, atomic bomb. People started to assume it was an allegory, a warning against atomic power. And Tolkien was explicit in setting them straight. He says, of course, my story about the ring is not an allegory for the atomic bomb. It's about power exerted for domination. That's literally how he describes the story. He describes it in other ways as well. But in that moment, it's about power exerted for domination. And you can imagine why that was such a huge theme for him and for Lewis. I hope I made that point clear to the 1930s and 40s. It's the will to power, friends, that's tearing up Western civilization. So that's certainly a huge theme. Having said that, trying to partially answer your question again, Tolkien is a committed Catholic Christian. And he says on different occasions, he says, my story is about the fall. All good stories are about the fall. So there's a kind of embedded Christian theology in the story which you can't escape. But he's not like C.S. Lewis where he wants to be explicit. He wants to be modest. He wants to kind of be subversive in a good way. And that's part of the reason it can appeal to people across religious traditions and across cultures. I hope that helps answer the question. Great question. Got time for a couple more?
One more.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Elias Miller. My question is, what type of stories do we need today?
Wow. You're asking an intellectual historian, a history buff, what kinds of stories we need today. I'm totally out of my depth, but it's a great question. Let me think about it for a second. What kind of stories to try to meet this moment? To meet this moment. You know, I think because we've got so many young people who are struggling with the things I've suggested here of cynicism, moral indifference, I do think we need to somehow help young people on the one hand to, acknowledge there's a lot of darkness and deceit and propaganda and violence and things we can't explain and shouldn't accept in this world. Be frank about it. I think maybe a partial answer to that would be back from a lecture that Tolkien gave in 1938, beginning in 1938, on dragons. Here's the kind of a story I think we need. Tolkien is talking to children. It's this Christmas lecture series, and he's asked to give a lecture on dragons to young people. And he's talking to this crowd of little kids, maybe 8, 9, 10, 12, 13 years old. And he says, well, wait a minute. Yeah, dragons are the embodiment of radical evil. There is evil in the world, and we must resist it. And here's the line that I think is for us, the kinds of stories we need. He says, dragons are the final test of heroes. Dragons are the final test of heroes. Are we going to go out and meet the darkness, struggle against the darkness, or not? And in the works of both these men, it's clear they are insisting that we do that very thing. Indifference, neutrality, compromise is just not an option. You've got to get in the game. You've got to get in the arena. So stories that make it clear that there's a choice involved Our choices echo into eternity, whether it's a tiny hobbit or a mouse named Reapy Cheep. Our choices really matter for good if they're done in faith. So thank you.
Please join me in thanking
Thank you,
Joe.
guys. Thank you.
Okay. This book, you can't even get this on Amazon until next Tuesday, but Joe's publisher was kind enough to send us about 60 copies. Reach underneath your chair. If you have one of these, you get a free signed copy of this book. So on your way out, our staff is going to be at the table. Hand them that ticket, and you have that slide. One quick announcement. Monday at 12:15, Dr. Deb Shuffle is going to be giving a last lecture. We hope you will join us for that. Thank you all. I hope you have a great evening. We are adjourned.